Since the United States was created in 1776, it's been involved in war for almost its entire existence. Since World War II especially, America has been in a permanent war economy. There's always been a vocal debate about how much America should be intervening beyond its borders, but the country usually ends up taking a pro-war position. Whether it be the Spanish-American War, the World Wars, the Vietnam War, the War on Terror, or continued involvement in the Middle East, the US has pursued an aggressive foreign policy. In South America, the American state meddled, and continues to meddle, in the affairs of dozens of countries, and has even overthrown governments. The same has been done in the Middle East. Look no further than the overthrow of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 2011.
We came, we saw, he died.
A fascinating part of this is that foreign interventions are usually unpopular. Most Americans never wanted America to be a globalist empire. During the Vietnam and Iraq wars, millions of Americans protested in the largest anti-war protests in modern history. Foreign interventions are so unpopular that presidential candidates often run on keeping America out of war, even when they intend to go back on their promises and enter anyway. Woodrow Wilson in World War I and Lyndon B. Johnson in Vietnam are two clear examples. Many of these wars ended disastrously, either for Americans or the people of the country being invaded by the US. What's worse, some of these wars were launched on completely false pretenses. In this video, I'll be explaining why America's foreign wars are worse than you thought. The world is getting more chaotic every day. That's why I've partnered with this video sponsor, Private Internet Access VPN. When you browse online without a virtual private network, or VPN for short, you're transmitting data out in the open that can be viewed by third parties. A virtual private network like PIA VPN hides your IP address and protects your connection with world-class encryption. It protects your online security and privacy by creating a secure tunnel between your device and the internet. PIA is trusted by millions of users. Their no-logs policy means your data is never stored or recorded. PIA also lets you avoid censorship. I use my VPN to get past country-based restrictions on YouTube videos. Streaming services like Netflix restrict some content based on your country. It's like paying for the director's cut of a movie but only getting the trailer. PIA lets you change your IP address to over 90 countries, letting you view what's available in those locations. For example, if you want to watch the legendary Lord of the Rings trilogy, you need to select an Italian or Japanese VPN server because the movies aren't available for US or UK viewers. PIA works on all platforms: Windows, Mac, Android, and more. You can use one subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. Sign up for PIA VPN using my link and you'll get an 83% discount plus 4 extra months completely for free. Use my link in the description or pinned comment to start using PIA VPN today. When analyzing American foreign policy and wars, there's a key fact that needs to be understood: geography. Something that makes America unique is how safe the country is from a geographic perspective. The US is flanked by two huge oceans. Its neighbors to the north and south, Canada and Mexico, are friendly and much militarily weaker. The US is full of natural resources and has the population to make use of them. The country is 3,800,000 square miles and full of space, so people aren't crammed together and they have plenty of room. The European empires of the 19th and 20th centuries had none of these luxuries. They either lacked natural resources, had too many people crammed into too little space, or had rival empires right on their border. This is what led them to compete with each other and sometimes even launch wars. America is unique in that it doesn't have to fight anyone to be strong. Despite this, American leadership has consistently engaged in unnecessary foreign aggression. War has always been a part of human history. Strong states tend to dominate weak states. There will never be a utopian future where all war ceases to exist. War can even be just under certain circumstances. But as we'll see with the US, many of its wars were simply not necessary. America's foreign policy has come in different stages. It started in the colonial era. In this era, America was still relatively small and weak. It conquered its Native American neighbors, but tried to avoid conflict with Europe. President George Washington famously warned against entangling alliances that could draw the country into unnecessary wars. But the first signs of America's aggression to Europe came with the Monroe Doctrine. It essentially declared the entirety of North and South America to be in the US government's sphere of influence. Imagine any other country declaring two whole continents to be its exclusive territory. This flew in the face of European empires, many of which still had colonial interests in the New World. But to be fair to the creators of the Monroe Doctrine, they agreed to it on the basis that America would in turn stay out of Old World affairs. As we'll see, that promise will later be reneged on. This led into the next era of American foreign policy, which came after the country industrialized and recovered from the Civil War. This could be called the Open Imperialism era. The Spanish-American War is widely considered by historians to be the beginning of the American Empire. In 1898, Spain had been fighting to put down a revolt in its province of Cuba, which it had held for almost 500 years. The US government used the opportunity to launch a war against Spain, who was much smaller and less prepared for war than America. Spain had never really done anything to provoke America's aggression. The war was justified from the American perspective through exaggerated stories of Spanish atrocities against the Cubans. The explosion of the USS Maine was also blamed on Spain to stoke support for war. This was a lie. Investigations later confirmed the ship sunk from an internal explosion, not an external one. It's basically agreed on today that support for this war was created through manufactured consent. Powerful journalists like Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst ginned up support for war with false stories and propaganda. Spain was suppressing a violent rebellion in its territory as any other nation would, yet it was treated as the devil incarnate. The American ruling class supported the war because they found it beneficial to their interests. The official explanation was that Cuba and Spain's colonies would be brought freedom. The war ended with America seizing Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. This war set the stage for the next century. It was the beginning of trends that have characterized most American wars since: atrocity propaganda and false flags being used to justify interventionism. If a war couldn't be justified to the public based on real pretenses, false ones would be invented. Simultaneously, this was the first of many times the US undermined European global power in favor of itself. The next major intervention the American establishment embarked on was World War I. I did an entire video on this if you'd like to know more. To quickly recap, American bankers loaned vast sums of money to the Entente, mainly Britain and France. Arms dealers engaged in blatant war profiteering. The sinking of the Lusitania, supposedly a civilian ship carrying Americans, was used as a major pretext for war. In reality, the ship was carrying weapons and ammunition. Propaganda coming out of British media was even worse. Roughly 90% of the atrocities they reported were fake. All of this resulted in politicians declaring war on Germany. Some people point to the Zimmerman Telegram as the reason America joined, but this is a misunderstanding. The Zimmerman Telegram offered a defensive alliance with Mexico in the case America joined against Germany. In other words, Germany already believed America was joining the war before this telegram was sent. The consequences of America's involvement in World War I were catastrophic for human history. The tens of millions of Americans who stood against the war were silenced. Next was World War II. Many today believe that America sat back in isolationism until Japan decided to randomly attack it. But the reality is much different. America was nowhere near isolationist in the 1930s. The public leaned toward isolationism, but not the government itself. Like in World War I, opposition to joining World War II was widespread in American popular opinion. Great Americans like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh advocated neutrality. Ford even refused to manufacture war materials for the British. Father Charles Coughlin, one of the most popular radio broadcasters in America, railed against those trying to get America into another European war. However, despite this popular sentiment, the Roosevelt administration had other ideas. Professor Bear F. Bromoller of Harvard University wrote in The Myth of American Isolationism that the American government was engaging in undeclared warfare against Germany and Japan months before Pearl Harbor. This included fighting German ships and putting a full embargo on Japan. He writes, "Only Hitler's unwillingness to provoke formal American opposition kept the US out of the war on paper. Likewise, America's Lend-Lease program to the Soviet Union began in the summer of 1941, months before the Pearl Harbor attack. Billions of dollars in war materials helped the Soviet Union during the critical years of Operation Barbarossa." What the actual historical record shows is that it was Germany who wanted peace with America during World War II, while it was the US government moving for war with them. Unlike what propaganda shows like The Man in the High Castle depict, Germany could never have hoped to touch the American mainland. The Axis had neither the ability nor the desire to conquer and divide up America. The Japanese and German governments only attacked the US as a last resort. This is far from the common but incorrect view that America was an oblivious, innocent observer of World War II. This applies to both world wars. America didn't wake up from a coma and find a destroyed Europe. It actively played a role in bringing about that destruction. After the Allied victory in the war, the Cold War began. The Allies and Soviets, who had spent almost a decade working together, now turned against each other. What followed was decades of American global interventionism. Any government in Africa or Latin America that swayed from US interests was targeted with regime change. The largest and most disastrous of America's interventions was the infamous Vietnam War. Here there was once again a false flag attack to justify the invasion. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was claimed by the US government to be an attack on an American ship by the North Vietnamese. In reality, no such attack ever happened. Though it never occurred, the event was used by President Lyndon B. Johnson as reason for war. The war was also justified through domino theory, the idea that if any country in the world became communist, it would make other countries also become communist. This theory would later be proven false, but notice how it rests on the assumption that America has the right to dictate what form of government every country in the world follows. In the end, America fought in Vietnam from 1964 to 1973. Over 60,000 Americans died and 150,000 were wounded. On the Vietnamese side, around 500,000 died. The war was such a disaster that the word Vietnam is now synonymous with quagmire. The American public despised the war, and the enormous backlash to the military-industrial complex forced them to abolish the draft in 1973. Since then, the US military has been an all-volunteer force, but as we'll see, that hasn't stopped the interventions. By the late stages of the Cold War in the 1980s, American diplomacy entered a new era. From here on out, it would become dominated by groups known as the neoconservatives and the neoliberals. The groups have slight differences, but they agree on the key objective: use the American empire as a Frankenstein's monster for war with total disregard for Americans or people in other countries. Many are Zionists with close ties to Israel, and they bend American foreign policy to be more in line with Israel's objectives. They were, and remain, happy to use either the Democrat or Republican Party to achieve this. They first pulled America into the Gulf War in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Fake stories of Iraqis taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators and leaving them to die were used to generate public support for the war. This was atrocity propaganda given in the halls of Congress that would later be disproven. Even after Iraq was defeated, American-led sanctions put on the country killed around 1 million Iraqis, most of which were children. US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said killing them all was a worthy price to pay for America and Israel's goals.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima.
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Then, in the early 2000s, America began the so-called War on Terror and invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. Invading Iraq was infamously justified through claims of non-existent weapons of mass destruction. This destructive invasion of Iraq killed 4,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Christianity in Iraq was protected under Saddam, but when he was overthrown, the Christian population of Iraq collapsed, and groups like ISIS gained power. Meanwhile, in Libya in 2011, the government of Muammar Gaddafi was toppled and the country plunged into civil war due to American intervention there. Simultaneously, proxy warriors in Syria were funded, leading to a civil war there. It should be emphasized that the American-backed civil wars in Libya and Syria are a part of what propelled mass immigration into Europe over the last decade. If you're an American who doesn't like mass immigration, you must oppose these foreign interventions. The beneficiaries of all of this were the military-industrial complex and the State of Israel. It certainly wasn't the American taxpayer. To this day, the war on terror has cost Americans $8 trillion and counting. This is without mentioning the growth of the security state and the loss of quality of life American citizens suffered as a result. The American establishment justifies its foreign interventions by claiming they're in America's interests. By this they mean the American system's interests, American corporations, the American state, the American bureaucracy. Common American citizens may or may not benefit. Publicly, wars are dressed in idealistic language about freedom and democracy. But in actuality, it's just about brute power. Popular elected governments are overthrown without a second thought as quickly as so-called dictatorships. And people whose country is wrecked obviously don't benefit. The scholar John Mearsheimer compares America to a type of crusader state, invading other countries abroad to spread its ideology. But I do think an asterisk should be put on this. The American system does use democracy as a weapon, but it also abandons it the moment it becomes inconvenient. American officials wave ideology around as a club, but history has shown it's just used to serve two purposes. First, to garner public support for what the government already wants to do. And second, to grant moral legitimacy to what will inevitably be extremely immoral actions. But of course, this is not only ideological, but also economic and geopolitical. American capitalists want new markets to expand into, and war is one way to achieve that. Liberal democracies seem to be, conveniently, the easiest type of government for the American state to bend to its interests. Once a country is a liberal democracy, international capitalists can buy off their politicians. At the same time, hate speech laws are implemented that ensure it's illegal to speak out or organize against the ruling ideology. The whole country is then at Washington's mercy. See modern Germany and Britain, which are destroying their economies by unquestionably following Washington's orders. If America were open about its imperial goals, that would be one thing, but it's a country that paradoxically is an empire that claims to be against all empires. It refuses to acknowledge the legitimate interests of other countries, even its own allies. We see this in the hyper-moralizing language American leadership uses against any rival.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Realpolitik is the concept that nations will act pragmatically in their own best interests. This idea is basically ignored by American politicians. According to them, only America and Israel get to act in their own best interests. Everyone else in the world can't. This itself is a form of imperial strategy, even an attempt at world domination. Meanwhile, the Israel lobby is also an element of American foreign policy that can't be ignored. The Zionist lobby was instrumental in pulling America into the Middle East and the war on terror. This influence remains extremely strong today, as AIPAC pours tens of millions of dollars to knock anti-Israel politicians out of office. They have many willing enablers in the neoconservatives and the neoliberals they work with.
If this capital crumbled to the ground, the one thing that would remain is our commitment to our aid, our cooperation with Israel.
America's support for Israel's endless wars and endless war crimes has ended the debate about what really drives American foreign policy. It's not about human rights or international law, and it never was. As I make this video, the US government is unconditionally backing Israel as it breaks every international law the US claims to be the guardian of. All of America's moral denunciations of its rivals look absolutely laughable compared to what it allows Israel to do. Benjamin Netanyahu's 2024 speech to US Congress broke the record for standing ovations for a speech there, with over 50 ovations. That's enough to make Kim Jong-un blush. What this history shows is that America's wars have largely been unnecessary, and in many cases, outright based on lies. These wars have mostly come at the expense of Europe, going as far back as the Monroe Doctrine that pledged to keep Europe out of the New World. America was born from Europe, but over time turned against it. How the American government became so anti-European and anti-Christian is a subject that warrants further study. Fortunately, the American public today does not want more foreign wars. This is especially true for white Americans, who simply no longer see America as representing them or their interests. This is why the American establishment has resorted to using proxy warriors to do its bidding. Even if another war was declared, things look grim for the American military. It's shrinking by the year as young people no longer have any interest in joining. As of the latest polls, fewer than 10% of eligible youth want to enlist. Those who want to join do so for financial reasons, not because they believe in the American project. Enormous portions of American youth are also unfit for service due to drug abuse, obesity, and mental health problems. This shows that the horrendous domestic policies America has pursued over the last century are coming back to bite it, and the results aren't pretty. This comes as the Ukraine war has turned against NATO and the US despite hundreds of billions worth of weapons being sent. Between Ukraine and Israel, America's international system has lost both moral legitimacy and efficacy. The very future of America is currently unclear. People under 40 in America are also the most anti-Israel generation in American history. Unlike past generations, they're able to get information about the Middle East from sources that aren't filtered through a Zionist lens. This will pose complications for the America-Israel relationship in the future. The lesson we can all take away from this history is that war propaganda is real, and even smart people can fall for it. The American state has proven itself uniquely dishonest with the false flag attacks and atrocity propaganda it's used to justify its wars through history. For a long time, Americans felt like they benefited from their government's reckless wars abroad, but that belief is becoming more ridiculous and less common every year. America already has all the land and resources it needs to be powerful. Its failure to use this land and resources effectively is the fault of its own system, not some foreign boogeyman. While the wars and interventions have been bad, we also shouldn't forget the countless American men and women who opposed the conflicts and stood up for what's right even in the face of overwhelming opposition from the system. They will stand as a shining example for us all forever. This has been Pax, and thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on all this. If you'd like to see more videos, please consider supporting the channel. Also, make sure to check out Private Internet Access VPN through the links provided below. As always, I will see you in the next video.